to send the request to the third-party service, and HTTP response is used to get the response. A simple callout will return the response. So in this case, our source is a Salesforce organization. So we'll use the Salesforce because we perform the callouts from the Salesforce, and target is any endpoint URL. So for example, Google API, or if you have any client endpoint URLs, you can consume them. So once you hit the service, the response can be in different formats in this case. So you may get the XML response, you may get the JSON, or it returns the string type of response, or even it returns the list of wrapper data. So data can be in any format. So but whereas in SOAP, we generally deal with the XML data, but here, so we can deal with any kind of data. It depends on the service. It depends on how the service is, how they built the services in the target end. Even these are the services. So, but the services are in the form of endpoint URLs. So what they do is they build these services in different technologies like in Java, .NET, or whatever the platform they choose. I mean that party people will choose, and they will host the service I mean they will host the application in the portals. I mean in their networks, so that the application can be accessible through anyone. The application can be accessible through anyone. The portal, and I mean here the endpoint URL is nothing but where the service is located in their organization. They have some internet portal. So once they host the application in the internet portal, they can be accessible through the internet. So they give us the endpoint URL where the service is located. So here endpoint URL is the folder where they put the service files. So when you hit the service file will react and it will return the response based on the logic they have written. So it's simply a service callout, a third party web service callout. So generally when you work for any such integration projects, so your customer will provide you the endpoint URL. So they may write the applications either in Java, .NET, and they will publish those applications in the binary formats, and they will put somewhere in the internet portal, and they will give us, finally they give us the endpoint URL. So here the endpoint URL means where the file is located. So the address of the published files. So we can directly consume them. So this is how the integration takes place. So for this integration, so we simply use HTTP request and response classes to hit the service and get the response. And here HTTP callouts with authentication, we call it as a REST API. HTTP callout without authentication, we call it as a normal callouts, normal HTTP callouts. So we deal with the normal HTTP callouts today, and probably in coming classes we deal with HTTP callouts with the authentication. So that is a REST API. So uh, let's go to a practical scenario where you can have a look on this. So we'll cover the both XML parsing and JSON parsing. So we'll see how the JSON response is and how the XML response is, and we'll parse the data and we perform some DML operation. So we'll enhance the application as per our need. So let me log into the Salesforce organization. So we can log into either source organization or target organization. So because here our SFDC is a source. So we use two classes. One is HTTP request to send the request parameters, and another one is HTTP response to get the response from the service, from the third party service. So the integration takes place based on endpoint URL. So the entire integration takes place based on the endpoint URL. So here endpoint URLs are the key areas where the integration takes place. Whereas in SOAP integration, the key area is HDL file. Whereas in REST integration and HTTP callout, the key area is endpoint URL. So endpoint URLs are the key areas where we can make the callouts from Salesforce. So the endpoint URL is a service URL. The service can be created in any platform. So it can be a .NET service, or it can be a Java service, or it can be the PHP service. Any service URL that can be used from the Salesforce. So the diagram, just for your reference, how the process is. So here is a Salesforce organization. So we call it as a source. So this is a source organization, and from this organization I would like to call the service. So you can consider any public URL. So this is a service URL. You can see API dot something. So there is a public service URL. I'm going to consume this, and the response you can see here. This is a JSON response. So this is the actual JSON response. So JSON means a JavaScript object notation, and this is a one type of response we generally use in Salesforce. So not only in Salesforce, there are mostly two responses. One is XML or JSON, either XML or JSON. So JSON is an object, JavaScript object notation. We call a JavaScript object notation, and XML is extensible markup language. So either these are the two. So these are the two formats we get always. So in modern programming, which means in SFDC, so mostly we use JSON related responses. In terms of parsing, so we have some JSON parser classes, and we can easily parse the data. So what if the response is in JSON? We have some pre-built JSON parser classes, and using the parser classes, we can easily parse the response, and we can consume the response according to our customer requirement. So it depends on up to the customer logic. So with the response, if you are creating the data, or if you are just displaying the data, or if you are doing some other operations, that is just a customizable logic using our Apex code. But till the point where you get the response, till the point to get the response, that is API programming. So this is the sample response. So we call a JSON response. So this is a sample response, the test response. So which is this is the endpoint URL. So the URL that you enter in the browser, so that is an endpoint URL. So it returns some of the contact information. If you see, so in this, so let's say my requirement is I would like to hit the service URL and I would like to get the response. I would like to see how the response is, how to parse the data. So generally this is a case we get the requirements. So you hit the endpoint URL, get the response and parse the response and write your custom logic as per your need. So in the JSON response, I have different nodes. You can go through each one. So ID is the one, name, email, and the address parameter, and gender parameter, and phone parameter. So I have the different nodes. So this is JSON related response, and we'll talk about the XML again. So let's call the service. Let's consume this service. So in your case, client will give you only this URL. So this endpoint URL, and he will give you some brief idea about what the data and what exactly the requirement is. So when client give us the endpoint URL, so that you need to call the service and you need to get the response and need to pass the response as per the response you get. If it is an XML response, we use XML parser classes, or if it is JSON response, we'll use the JSON parser classes. And once the data is in the local, I mean once the data is in your controller, your Visual Force and Apex code, probably you can write your normal Apex to do the DML operations or whatever the logic you want. So what are the steps? So let's say you have the endpoint URL. So what are the steps you have to use? So one is for any integrations, remote site setting configuration. So add your endpoint URL to the remote site settings. This is the first step. So whatever the integration, so if it is a SOAP or if it is a REST or if it is any third party integration, the first thing is if you have an endpoint URL, I need to add the endpoint URL to the remote site settings. That is a generic step. So I have an endpoint URL here. Just copy the endpoint URL and go to remote site settings. So new remote site. So I'm just adding this remote site setting. So this is the remote site settings where we have the list of contact information. So I just configured this remote site URL, this web service URL. So here the endpoint URL is our third party web service. So this is what we have so this is what the service it returns the contact information. So this is a URL I just configured in Salesforce. Then in next step, use a HTTP request to send the request to third party service and use a HTTP response to get the response. So this is the next step. So let's start the coding here. So once you configure the endpoint URL, you can write your code. So you can create. So we don't hard code the endpoint URLs anywhere. So what you can do is you can also create the same endpoint URL either in custom setting or custom labels. I'm just creating a new custom label to configure this endpoint URL. So this is my endpoint URL, contacts endpoint URL. Save it. So you can use this label name. So whenever you refer the code, so whenever if you want to refer this endpoint URL, you can just use this contacts endpoint URL like how you did in the SOAP integration to capture the user password and security tokens. We're going to create a logic for it. So create a Visual Force page. Let's say my Visual Force page is HTTP VF, and create a controller for it. HTTP controller, or whatever the name which is suitable for you for the requirement. HTTP contacts controller. So I'm going to add this to the controller. So better to write the code in the developer console, so because you get the IntelliSense support. So no need to remember all the methods. When you type something, immediately it will show you the syntax for that. So first thing, so we'll hit the service. The first thing is we hit the service, and let's see how the response is. So how to hit the service? As I told you, so we have two classes. One is HTTP request and another one is HTTP response. So this HTTP request has mainly two methods. So one is set method and set endpoint. What is a set method? So set method contains either get or put. Get means we are getting the response. Put means we are posting something. So in this case we use the get because I'm going to get the response from the third party service, and HTTP response. So HTTP response is just a using a string variable you can store the response parameters. So let me show you. First define HTTP request to param equal to, so this is the variable, equal to new HTTP request. So this is a declaration for HTTP request class. So when you write something, probably you can put some comments. So who is the author and what is the date of writing, 23rd 2016, and what is the description, so that if any other developers working on the same functionality, they can easily understand based on the comments you provide. So always when you write something, better to provide the comments so that it will be more easy for other developers. They can easily read your code. This class is used to send the request to the endpoint URL to get the list of contacts. This class parses JSON data to the required format. Something you can provide some lines of description so that even for you it is easier. So in case if you are um, in case if you have some changes later after 6 months or 1 year period, you can just go through the class and read the comments you entered, so that you don't need to go for line by line. So you can easily understand what is the purpose of the class and what exactly it does. That's why we provide the comments. So HTTP request and request parameter is the variable. So you have to set the method. One is endpoint URL. So no need to write anything, remember anything, just enter the dot. You can see. So different methods you have. One is, so you need to set the method first. You can go to the set methods. So one is set endpoint. So our endpoint URL is, this is endpoint URL. So how to get the label value? So you can use label dot contact endpoint URL. So this is the set endpoint method, and request param dot, and you have to set what is the type, what is the method type. So it is a get method, so to get the response. I'm not posting anything, so I'm just sending the request to get the response. So we'll use the get method here, and so this is about just request parameters. So what are the response parameters? You just remember two methods, set endpoint or set method. So even you can get the syntaxes in our Apex developer guide. So just simply use set endpoint method and set method. So if it is, if you are just getting the response, just use the get. So this is your endpoint URL, label dot contacts endpoint URL, and the HTTP response. So I'm just declaring HTTP an extra parameter, HTTP param equal to new HTTP. So this is another class. So using this HTTP param, you can get the response. So you need to see here you have some methods. You need to send the request. So it can be any request. Send the request. So what is the request you have? So this is a request param. You have to send the request parameter to the send method of HTTP, and it will return the HTTP response. The type of the response is HTTP response. So response equal to, save it. Yeah, I don't see any errors, any syntax errors. So first, this is the request parameter. So we are sending the request through set endpoint and set method. So these are the request parameters, and we are sending the request here using HTTP standard class. And once you send the request, the response is in the HTTP response. From the response, so this response has a multiple parameters. So it has a status and it has a body, and you need the body parameter. So I'm declaring string str response, string response equal to this response dot get body. So it has, see, when you type response, it will show you different parameters. So I need a get body. If you want to see what is a body, so just put the debug statement str response service responses, just to put the response in debug. A smaller code, just is the 5 lines of code, no need to remember much. So you have the standard methods, just use the standard methods and your endpoint URL. So when you call this service, it will return the response. So this is in constructor, so just create an instance for it. I'm going to execute in an anonymous window. So this is my variable, so I'm just created an instance. When I click on execute button, now go to the file, open raw log. You can see what is the response you get. So this is the service response I got. So from here, so this is all the service response. So this is what I can see in my endpoint URL too. So this is what I can see. So when you hit some endpoint URL, what is the response you have in that page? So that will be part of your response. We are simply adding the remote site settings and performing HTTP request and response to get the response from this endpoint URL. So I have the response so that I can write my logic further. So any questions you have till this point?
So, Sadiq here. So I have a question here. So it's a basic difference. So till yesterday we talked about SOAP API, right?
Yeah,
Where we have that endpoint, where it points to a web service of source.
exactly.
But here in this case, the REST API, when we are accessing that endpoint URL, it's just simply throwing us the response. So does that actually have a web service in the backend which is running when we are hitting that URL?
Exactly. It has a service in the backend. So there is a service in the backend which is hosted in their portals, in their intranet portals. So when you hit the endpoint URL, the service should invoke, and we get the response based on the service they built. Actually, this has a service in the backend. It's not the plain data. It has a service in the backend. So they are using. So this is a public URL. Even we can't say what is the database they are using to fetch this data to prepare the JSON string. This is a sample URL I found in the online. So just for demonstration. So this URL is given by the customer, and there should be a backend service. When you hit the service, and it will execute the service and return the response. Probably they wrote some code to generate this JSON from their database. They simply query the data and they prepare the JSON string and they're sending back to response. There should be a service in the backend actually.
So does this REST callout don't require any user authentication? Like we
Yeah,
need to have
yeah, that's why there
authentication?
are two type of HTTP callout. So with authentication and without authentication. For public web URLs, you don't need any authentication. This is a normal HTTP callout. So if you provide an authentication, so we will call it as a REST API. So it's a part of the REST API without authentication. Simply hitting the public URLs.
Okay, thanks.
So there are some Google APIs. Assume that Google APIs. Some endpoint URL requires some inputs from the request. Let's say you would like to find the zip code. So based on the city. So that's a Google API. So what you can do is, if you have the Google API, you simply call the Google API by passing the city parameter and it will return back the zip code as a response. So it doesn't require any authentication in that case. They're the public endpoint URLs.